Morning, everyone. So it looks like you're in a nice big room and much bigger than the crowd. It looks like. So I hope you're having a good morning in this program. Joseph or Aaron, can you confirm that everything is okay and you can hear me well and you can see this?
Great. Yep, sounds good.
Okay. All right. Let's get started. So my topic is nitrogen management with Adapten, and there's sort of an important soil health context to nitrogen management. So if we improve soil health, we change a lot of things around the production environment. We make the yields higher. We have more organic matter. We may have effects from maybe organic matter application or cover crops or different rotations, and they can all be accounted for in nitrogen management. Okay, so as most of you know, I think you're experienced professionals. Managing nitrogen is very challenging because it's such a dynamic property. We also have many sources of nitrogen. We have fertilizer, we have manure, we have very different types of manure. We may have swine manure or dairy manure or chicken manure, all very different. And then we have these many different loss pathways, denitrification, leaching, ammonia volatilization, etc. All of these things are highly influenced by weather condition, soil, and crop management. So it's a real challenge to get a good nitrogen rate. An additional challenge with nitrogen management is that we have what we call asymmetric producer risk. What that means is that it is a lot more costly to a farmer if you don't apply enough nitrogen than it is to I'm sorry, there's a little bit of an echo, so I need to turn that down a little bit. So there's a lot greater risk for not applying enough nitrogen than there is excess. If you apply too much nitrogen, then there's cost from the additional nitrogen fertilizer, which is not inconsequential, but still it's nothing compared to having a major reduction in yield loss. It's just much more costly. So now we sort of have this new reality in the context of soil health, the main topic here. We have climate change, we have more extreme weather conditions, which we know impacts nitrogen. We have more diverse production environments, new management practices, soil health, organic matter inputs, etc. But we also have some opportunities. We have new equipment, we have stabilizers, we have new applicators and all that, and so we have more opportunities in the context of implementing the 4R+, which I'll talk about in a minute. And so basically the traditional guidelines are not really very capable of addressing all these different nutrient management needs and don't account for these changes in production environments. So just you've probably seen this map before, but this just shows the increases in heavy precipitation events over a 50-year period. That's the most recent one that we have data on. And we see that notably the Northeast, we've seen a lot more higher intensity rainfall events, and we know that those are the ones that most impact nitrogen management, especially if they occur in the early part of the growing season. You know, other parts of the country are similarly impacted, but it's interesting that the Northeast is in fact the most. So that brings us to 4Rs or 4R+, which is 4R and soil health, which is a concept that the Nature Conservancy is promoting. And I'm sure you're familiar with it, right? Source, rate, time, and place. And we sort of have a pretty good idea of what are good sources, what is good timing, and placement, but the big challenge is, given source, time, and place, what is the correct rate? And that one is very difficult to estimate. So so that's what tools like Adapten do, and that can account for all these production environment factors. So if we just focus for now on source, timing, and placement, we know that they can greatly affect loss potential. The fertilizer source or formulation, especially the ammonia fraction, can greatly impact how much you lose, in part on whether it's been incorporated or not. And so this includes even organic sources, of course, manure. We may lose a lot of nitrogen through ammonia volatilization. We do have some opportunities with enhanced efficiency products, things like stabilizers or controlled release products that can reduce both the losses, but also allows us to reduce the overall N rate if we can basically account for those reduced losses. And then we know that timing relative to rainfall and also temperature conditions is really very critical in terms of losses. So I'd like to go over a few scenarios here. So this graph, you may have seen, it's from the University of Illinois. It shows the nitrogen uptake by corn as a function of growing degree days, which is more or less a timeline. But keep in mind that growing degree days don't accumulate very quickly in the early part of the growing season. So what you see here is initially a slow period of uptake, then a more rapid period of uptake towards the late spring, early summer, mostly in the vegetative part, and then towards the end of the season, we see that most of this nitrogen is then being translocated towards, especially the grain. And at the end of the season, about 60% of the nitrogen ends up in the grain, and the remainder is in the stover, which, if it's harvested for grain, is being recycled onto the field. So I'm going to get rid of that legend, and so I'm going to look at some scenarios. So first, let's look at what nitrogen the soil supplies. So depending on the organic matter content, you start out with a certain amount of nitrogen in the soil. In this case, about 30 to 40 maybe pounds per acre. That's sort of naturally in the soil, and that then increases as the soil warms up. And so, if you want to perfectly predict the rate that you need to apply, you account for how much has been supplied by the soil, and then you supply the remainder as fertilizer. If you have a soil that is higher in organic matter, or it has improved soil health, that means that the soil can supply more nitrogen, and then the amount of supplemental fertilizer you need to provide is then less. So you can basically account for the benefits of having more organic matter in the soil. So let's go back to that second scenario. And but in the early part of the growing season, because there's more nitrogen in the soil than has been taken up by the plant, some of that is subject to losses. So in this case, with the blue line, you see that there's some losses from some precipitation events. So now in this case, we have the soil supplies less nitrogen, or at least some of that nitrogen has been lost. And so we need to supply a different amount of nitrogen again. So even though this is a soil that has quite a bit of organic matter, and in principle could supply quite a bit of nitrogen to the crop, we lost some of that nitrogen due to precipitation events. So if you have a wet spring, you need to apply more nitrogen. So here's just an illustration of that. This is a field in Iowa in 2015, 19 inches of rain in the early part of growing season, very wet. And then in 2012, which is a very dry year. And you can see that the total amount of nitrogen that was needed for that field was quite a bit different for those 2 years. So that's just an illustration, and these are adaptant recommendations. Okay, let's go back to this graph. So now we have a situation where we have some nitrogen being supplied by the soil in the early part of the growing season. Then we fertilize, and so we really bring up the nitrogen level in the soil. And if we predict how much is needed, then at the end of the season, we would perfectly match the amount of nitrogen that's needed to raise this crop, okay, in an idealistic situation. Now, if we have a wet growing season and we lose some of that nitrogen in the early part of the growing season, so in that case, we predict that we need more nitrogen to be supplied as fertilizer, as side dress. But then we could still, subsequent to side dress, let's say we side dressed on June 15th, But on June 20th, we have another major rainfall event, and now we actually stand to lose quite a bit of nitrogen because there was a lot in the soil. So even if we lose 20% of that, that's a fairly significant loss of nitrogen. And then we still come up short at the end of the growing season. And so what we would want to do in that case is to go back a little bit later in the season again with high clearance equipment and make up for those losses. Another approach would be to say you have a wet growing season and you account for that risk that you may have post-side dress nitrogen losses, and you just apply a lot more nitrogen, and so that in the end you still come out just about right. But the problem with that is if you don't get subsequent rainfall, then of course you have too much nitrogen in the system, and then you have of course an environmental issue. So this is the challenge, but as you could see, we go back to this scenario. The best case is to more or less estimate how much is needed, and then have that capability to go in later in the season to correct any deficiencies if it's a very wet year, okay? So that's where some of the new equipment comes in that allows you to do that. So this high clearance equipment that certainly in the Midwest we see increasingly adopted, and there's a number of farmers here in New York as well. Probably you guys know them better than I do. But I think this allows us to much better fine-tune and more precisely predict and apply the amount of nitrogen that's needed. So I want to go back and look at sort of all of these factors that influence nitrogen. So we might say we have resource factors like the soil type or soil health, climate. We have management factors, as you can see here, cultivar, rotations, tillage, cover crops. So these are very much related to soil health. We have the 3 R's minus rate, which is the big challenge. So we have source placement and timing. And then we have the weather factors that play into that. So how do the different nitrogen recommendation tools deal with that? So we have basically 2 types of tools, we might say. One is static and the other one is dynamic and adaptive. So the static tools are typically based on yield goals, and that's the most widely used, and that's the one used in New York. Or we have the more empirical approaches where basically a lot of trials have been done on many fields, and sort of an average response rate is and recommendation is being made. So these are certainly the yield goal method. You're probably familiar with it. Certainly the Cornell calculator from Cornell. Simple to use, no cost. But they are highly generalized, and they discount important factors like weather or changes in soil health and all that. And they're really not compatible with the 4R or soil health approach. They don't really account for these practices. The soil tissue test is a soil or tissue test is a more dynamic approach, like a PSNT. Probably many of you use that. You use ear leaves, etc. But here in New York, PSNTs are probably the most used, and they do sort of allow you to check in basically with the field and sufficiency status. There's some downsides of it. It's fairly high labor cost, and it has modest predictability, in part because you don't know what happens after you take that sample, and weather events can have a big impact. It is, however, you might say 4R and soil health compatible. Another group is the canopy sensors, like the Green Seeker, Optrix, the Yara N sensor, used a lot more in Europe. They have high site specificity. They allow you to do variable rate, can integrate with equipment, but they tend to be fairly big investments. For corn, they don't seem to work that well. They seem to work much better for cereal crops like wheat and barley, etc. But they are in principle 4R and soil health compatible. And then the last group is the one, of course, that I work in, Adapt in, and there's some other competing products that are process-based models, use a lot of data, and are also basically 4R and soil health compatible. So I'll talk more about Adapt-N, of course. So here's an example before I get there of the yield goal based method. This is typically referred to the Stanford approach. It basically says, you know, the amount of nitrogen that's needed is a function of how much is needed to get the yield minus what's supplied by the soil divided by an efficiency factor. So the New York Cornell calculator takes the yield potential, multiplies it by 1.2. This is in bushels per acre. Subtracts what comes from the soil, but which could be credits from, you know, rotation or manure, and then applies an efficiency factor. So that's a basic application of the Stanford approach. The empirical MRTN approach basically does a lot of, you know, on-farm response trials, sometimes on research farms, sometimes on commercial farms, and then it looks at sort of the average response, brings in some price information, basically the prices of grain and fertilizer, and then calculates an optimum rate. The price effect is typically not that great. I mean, this graph is somewhat misleading in that, you know, most of the time the price of corn grain, that is, and the price of fertilizer changes sort of about the same amount. So that price ratio is fairly constant. So these are the recommendation systems that are currently used in the US. Most states use an yield goal method, but and mostly the central states use the MRTN approach, the empirical approach. But if you look at the amount of corn that's associated with that and acres, of course, most of that is concentrated in these Midwestern states. So most of the corn in the US is being managed under this empirical MRTN approach, but it is a static approach. A few states have some guidelines around other technologies like sensor algorithms and things like that. So that brings me to Adapt-N. So Adapt-N is basically a decision support tool that allows you to manage nitrogen, currently focused on corn, but very soon also other crops. It's cloud-based and highly scalable, so you don't need to download software. It's all basically through web access. And it estimates the nitrogen dynamics and the crop end needs in a wide variety of production environments, which I'll explain. So it does basically, by more precisely estimating the nitrogen needs, it addresses both the farmer profitability and the environmental impacts. So basically, what does the tool do? It makes soil and crop simulations based on a daily time step. Then it simulates the water and nitrogen dynamics in the soil based on input on either farmer input or databases, soil and management and weather. Then it simulates corn growth. And then these two models interact, and then it estimates the supplemental nitrogen needs and provides additional information. And I'll show that to you in a few slides. So what it basically does, if you look at the top of the slide here, that's something that I presented 10 minutes ago. You have all these different aspects of the production environment that are then being integrated into the model and combined with weather data and soil information and all that. And then it simulates all these dynamic interactions. And it's important to point out that you can't really say, here's the cover crop effect and have that be one number, or here's the tillage effect or the crop rotation effect, because it interacts with soil type, with soil health, and especially it interacts with weather factors. So you need to have this dynamic approach to be able to make good recommendations. So when you do that modeling, then you can estimate how much nitrogen is in the soil and the crop. Then you can combine that with information on yield potential, because if you have higher yield, you need more nitrogen, and these prices and a risk component, and that then allows you to estimate what's hopefully the right end rate. So out of the 4 R's, you need to sort of account for all of these things before you can really actually estimate the end rate. Now, you can supplement that information with some external inputs, like, for example, a PSNT measurement, or you can use sensors like proximal or remote sensing. Proximal is things like green seeker. Remote sensing, of course, is things like satellites or airplane or even drone information. And all of that then potentially gives you better estimates. So before I proceed on AdaptN, I want to show this disclosures slide. It's what Cornell University wants me to do because we licensed AdaptN to a startup company, which is now part of Yara International, which is a global crop nutrition company. And so I am disclosing that I have an inherent conflict of interest in this relationship. Okay, proceeding on. So these are the features and inputs for AdaptN. So as I mentioned, daily time step simulations, and it uses historical climate data for some estimates, and I won't go into detail there. It determines the optimum N rate based on a mass balance approach, and I'll explain that later. The weather inputs are basically real time because they now become available very quickly. Solar radiation, max and min temperature, and precipitation. Then there's a number of soil inputs, and most of the information is based on NRCS database properties, the Surgo information, with some additional information that you see there. Crop inputs, cultivar maturity class, population, expected yield, and price. And then various management inputs related to tillage, irrigation, manure, crop rotation, and cover crops. And then, of course, what other fertilizer inputs are being made. So when and how much, and the placement and the depth and the price. There are some opportunities to do some in-field or in-season observations like data for emergence, or to do a PSNT that you can then enter into the tool. So what you see highlighted here are sort of factors that are inherently related to soil health. So these inputs are being changed by changes in soil health management, and that's how basically a tool like AdaptN can account for soil health management. And I'll come back to that. High resolution climate data that's now widely available. Initially, when we rolled this out over 10 years ago, that was a very new product. But this map here shows you how highly variable precipitation events are, especially if they are sort of these intense thunderstorms, and you may get a lot of rain, maybe 2.5 inches in one location, and maybe 10 miles up the road, you only got 1/2 inch or something like that. So having really good high resolution weather data is critical, and that's now much more widely available. And so here's some screenshots of AdaptN, so just to give you a little bit of a sense of what it looks like. And I know some of you have used the tool before. But basically, it can be done either at the field level, it can be done as zones, as in this case, or it can be done as full VRT, variable rate technology, where every 60 by 60 feet, you could in principle change the nitrogen rate, based on soil or organic matter information or whatever you have. So this recommendation is based on a mass balance equation, where the recommended rate is a function of how much nitrogen is needed to grow the crop, which is mostly based on the expected yield. How much is currently in the crop, so the crop is at V7, so there's a certain amount of nitrogen that has already been taken up, so we discount that. We also discount how much nitrogen is currently in the soil. So these latter two, the crop N and the soil N that's current, those are based on the model simulations. Then we also have kind of a stochastic approach that deals with potential losses that may occur after the application. And then we have credits for soybeans, and we have what we call a profit correction factor. That's a risk-based factor because of this asymmetric risk of under versus over fertilization. So that's the basic idea, and that's where the model come in. So going back to a screenshot here, one of the things that we built into the tool is a lot of details around how it came up with that recommendation. And I think a lot of the users of the tool, certainly the high-end field agronomists, they use that information quite effectively to be able to make some judgments on what happened to that field, and perhaps even make some adjustments that they feel are necessary. There's also a lot of graphical insights that are being provided, like how much loss there's been. In this case, we show the total precipitation as well as the gaseous and leaching losses. That can be extremely insightful for many users, and people kind of become more aware of what the environmental loss potential is of different management approaches, like different timing and things like that. Then you, of course, need to have an effective export tool. You need to basically be able to export the recommendation into a shapefile or something similar like that, so that it can be used in an applicator. It also has an alert feature, typically done through a mobile phone or something like that, where a user can be alerted based on whether an additional nitrogen application is needed. In this case, we set an alert threshold of 40 to decide whether that farmer or consultant should get a notification. So let's now talk about Adapten and soil health inputs. So how does Adapten really account for these different soil health practices, soil health management practices? So here are the four that it most specifically addresses, and I'll have a slide for each of those. So tillage and organic matter. So if you have built up the organic matter level of the soil, you have, in principle, more nitrogen that becomes available, more nitrogen being cycled basically in the system. And also, of course, if you change the tillage system, you have slight impacts on nitrogen. So this is the input screen for tillage methods. And here it's a strip till, zone till, and then the organic matter is accounted for by basically a soil test, which in this case is 3.5%. So the model accounts for that in terms of the placement of residue, the mineralization of organic matter, and the carbon and nitrogen pools. The next one is cover crops, and that's a fairly significant addition that we made a few years ago, working in collaboration with some scientists that work a lot with cover crops, Matt Ryan and Steve Mirsky at the ARS in Beltsville. So we have a fairly sophisticated input opportunity there. So here you can see the cover crop type. In this case, a mix of grass and legume, the stage of termination, the termination date, the quality of the stand, whether it's a poor stand, medium, or really good stand, and then the incorporation of the crop. So this is basically a matrix that shows you how that's being incorporated into the model. So we're looking at basically 5 different cover crop options: grass, legume, mixed with mostly grass, about a 50-50 mix, and then a mix with mostly legume. Then we look at 4 different stages of termination. So basically that's an indicator of how much cover crop biomass is available, and the termination date, and then how it's being incorporated. And so for each of those, there's biomass and C to N ratios assigned that then enter the simulation cycle. And placement and timing, of course, being also important. For example, did you fully incorporate it, or did you surface kill it and it stayed on the surface? So manure, it has a fairly good manure feature. New York being a dairy state, we put a lot of effort into the manure component, and it incorporated, whether it's incorporated or injected. Of course, the application date is important. The amount, and then the quality of the manure, basically in terms of the ammonium and organic and content, and the amount of solids. So that's a fairly intense set of inputs, but it's important because basically all these things matter quite a bit if you're managing manure. And then there's the rotation impact. What you see in this screen is some of the basic crop information on the left. Expected yield being important, I'll come back to that. And then you see the previous crop, basically the selection of different rotations that may apply to that case. And that again impacts the amount of biomass and the C to N ratio that's being returned to the soil, and that becomes mineralized then over time. So quick note about yield. It's an important part of nitrogen management. It's also an important part of soil health, because hopefully by improving soil health, you also increase your yield. And if you have higher yields, you need more nitrogen in the crop. Doesn't necessarily mean you need more nitrogen fertilizer, because some of that may come from the soil, but you need to account for it in the model, okay? And that can be highly spatially specific. You have areas of the field that yield better or less. We found that working with farmers, even consultants, that a lot of people are not really fully aware of the yield potential of their fields. They tend to underestimate that. It's possible that it's been because they never applied enough nitrogen. It may be because they don't really keep good records. But if people are off on the yield prediction, it tends to be on the low side. So now a little bit about the Adaptan history and how it's been developed. And I think it's important to go over that to sort of get an appreciation for sort of what it took. And then also, then we can talk about, how well the tool works or how well it does not work. That's up for you to decide. But it goes back quite a ways in terms of the initial field research and initial software development. And then the development of the Adaptan tool in and by itself in the early 2000s. We rolled it out in 2008. That's already 11 years ago. And then we made it available as a free tool, as a public domain tool. Then realized that it did need some investment from entrepreneurs and professional software engineers. So we licensed it in 2013 to this startup company that's now part of Yara International. We also in 2011 started a lot of on-farm trials and model refinements, which I'll talk about more. There's a listing here on the borders of a lot of our collaborators, and we've been very, very lucky to have had those. So here's a diagram that shows how the model was developed and tested. And I think it's important for everyone to sort of realize what it took to get to this point, and that it was really a lot of people who have contributed to that. So first was the sort of the modeling information, collecting of field data with lysimeter studies, etc. Then we calibrated the model, and then you use other data to validate. That is basically you test the model and you see how well it does, and you may do some adjustments. You may use that feedback to help and recalibrate. But then you go out to do an independent evaluation on commercial farms. So you get off the research farms and you go into real farms and you do strip trials, in many cases kind of at the field scale, and then you also use that information. Now, we've had a lot of very good collaborators on this independent evaluation from many places across the country. New York, we really had some great collaboration from Keith Severson from Cayuga County Extension, Western New York Crop Management, and also from ACS. Those people have really been great and have really helped us improve the tool, but also helped us sort of do some initial testing in a more, what you might call, safe environment, where people understand that, yes, we maybe need to still make some adjustments and not judge the tool immediately, but see that potential and recognize that calibrations are needed. So just going back to the very initial stages, the lysimeter studies at the Willsboro farm in the northeastern part of the state along Lake Champlain, a great resource because we had different soil types on the same farm, basically under the same weather conditions. And we did a lot of very intensive studies with these plots here. And we built these plots so that we can measure all the nitrogen that leaches out, and we can also measure how much is taken up and lost and all that. So this was just a great resources in terms of developing the tool. And you don't need to look at all the details here, but basically that allowed us to do calibration of the tool. There are parameters in the model that need to be adjusted based on, you know, regional or local conditions, and that basically allowed us to do that. And then you go out and then you do a validation. In this case, we, you know, looked at manure. We did a lot of manure studies on those lysimeter plots, and so that's basically what gave us a fairly good sense of what the model parameters needed to be under manured conditions. And we ended up even adjusting those later on based on some of these on-farm trials. So this is where the locations where we did a lot of the on-farm testing, going all the way into the Corn Belt. These are the ones that we basically have published information. There's a lot more that haven't even actually been published. So one set of trials was where we compared Adapten to what the grower would normally do. And these are results from New York on the left and Iowa on the right. And it basically shows that the grower rate in general was higher than the Adapten rate. So it's above that diagonal 1-to-1 line. So in fact, in 83% of the trials, the Adapten tool recommended less nitrogen than the respective grower rate, and an average reduction of about 40 pounds per acre. But there were a few cases where we recommended slightly more. The yield results were generally no impact. So basically we could get the same yields for with less nitrogen. And there were a few cases where Adapten yielded higher. And that's being illustrated in this graph, which I really like. It's one of my favorite graphs. We actually gave the data to another independent scientist, and he developed this graph where the x-axis shows the difference in N rate between the two methodologies, Adapten and grower. So on the left side, that meant that Adapten recommended less nitrogen than what the grower would use. And we see on the average, basically no yield impact or very little. On the right side, we see scenarios where Adapten recommended more nitrogen than the grower used, and we saw a good yield response. That means that when we recommended more nitrogen, it was justified. And of course, from a profit perspective, that becomes very attractive. The environmental impacts were such that, you know, because the grower in most cases recommended more or used more nitrogen than Adapten recommended, we had an average reduction of about 36% in the leaching losses from, this is simulated with the model, and about 39% less in gaseous losses. So with basically the same yields, we were able to reduce the environmental impacts fairly good, about 35 to 40%, you might say. We also did some comparisons with the traditional corn N calculator, which, as I discussed, is a static tool. One of the challenges with this calculator is that it either uses a default yield or you can use a realistic yield. If you use a default yield and you compare it with the economic optimum N rate, which is based on the N rate trials, you see that in most cases the Cornell N calculator severely underestimated the amount of nitrogen that was needed. But if you see by about 42 pounds, if you use the realistic yield-based approach with the Corn N calculator, you basically then overestimate the amount of nitrogen that's needed by a considerable amount, 36 pounds per acre. So that's one of the challenges with the Corn N calculator. Adapten in those trials was fairly close. The average N rate was 6 pounds per acre below the optimum N rate, so it's relatively close. And it also, followed the 1-to-1 line much better. So the RMSEs, which is an indicator of the error, were much lower. We also went back in the past couple of years to our lysimeters, and this is very familiar data to Aaron because he worked on some of it. We just got this published. And we went back and we compared the environmental impact in terms of leaching of Adapten versus the Cornell calculator. And the numbers are very similar to what we simulated in that we had about, on the loamy sand, we had about a 35% reduction in leaching losses, and on the clay loam about 31%. So very similar numbers between the two soil types, even though, of course, the sandy soil in general has more leaching than the clay soil. But they're also very similar in what we found overall on these on-farm trials. That using a tool like that, reduces the environmental losses by about a third by just basically following the recommendations. Nothing else. I mean, if you improve the other 3 R's, the timing and the formulation and all that, you can achieve greater gains. So what are some of the future directions? More in-season management. If you really want to be precise with nitrogen management, you need to go more in-season. More ensemble approaches, probably combining the models with sensors and artificial intelligence and machine learning. I think that has a lot of potential. All of these things can help with, better incorporating soil health information. The industry is very interested, not only the ag industries, but also the supply chain incentives, the companies that want to improve the sustainability of agriculture. And I think what we're going to be seeing, and we did some work on that, is some performance standards. N-balance is a tool that people are now looking at, and we did some work on that as well. So here's a picture of the @Farm app, which is a satellite-based. It's a Sentinel-2 satellite that Yara International, the company that now owns Adapten, they've made that available. This is a map that shows their N sensor based on satellite information, showing this field variability. And I think that there's considerable opportunities with integrating this type of information with the model-based information to get better site-specific and recommendations. So in conclusion, nitrogen is a dynamic nutrient. I think we all know that. Many sources of nitrogen, whether organic or inorganic, and some affected by soil health management, like organic matter content or manure or cover crop additions, etc. Production environments are very diverse, so we need to have tools that account for all these differences in production environments, whether it's soil type or soil health or management practices. New equipment offers great management opportunities, especially for more in-season management. Models and data improve nitrogen recommendations. I hope I've been able to convince you of that. Adapten does account for soil health practices, and Adapten this point is fairly well tested. We have a fairly good idea of its performance. There's always errors, there's always imprecision, but in general, taking this approach allows you to be more precise and to have kind of win-win outcomes for the farmer and for the environment. And with that, I will turn it back to Joseph or Aaron